Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Have you ever thought about how the salt you eat, like whether you sprinkle it on or it's already in processed foods, might be messing with your mood?
Ah,
Today, we are going deep, deep into a new study.
okay.
It looks at the possible connection between eating lots of salt and how we feel, especially behaviors that look like depression.
Interesting.
We have the actual scientific paper and a news article about it, and we want to understand, right, like what they found, what it means for you, and what the researchers say we still need to find out.
Sounds good.
So what's so interesting about this particular study?
Well, some older studies, they looked at big groups of people, right?
Yeah.
They hinted that there might be a link between high-salt diets and depression, but we didn't really get how it worked. This new study, though, it digs into the biology in a way that's, really new.
Okay, so let's break down the study. What were the scientists trying to figure out?
The main goal, right, was to see if and how a diet with tons of salt could actually cause depression.
Okay.
They wanted more than just patterns in people. They wanted to see if eating lots of salt was a cause, or at least, part of the reason people develop those depression-like symptoms.
I see. And how did they go about that? Like, what was the actual study?
So they used mice.
Okay.
They split them into groups.
Yeah.
One group had normal food with a standard amount of sodium chloride, table salt.
Right.
Another group got a diet super high in salt. I'm talking 8% of their food was sodium chloride. And their water even had 1% sodium chloride in it.
Wow.
They kept that up for 5 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
And they also had this other group of mice, right, that they stressed out on purpose.
Okay.
That's a common way to make mice act kind of like they're depressed.
I see. So high salt, normal, and stress, just to see how they compared. What did they actually measure in these mice?
Well, they looked at how much water they drank, their blood pressure, how much they weighed, how much they ate, that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing was how they measured those behaviors that are like depression.
Yeah.
They use these really established tests like the open field test. It checks how much they explore, which tells you about anxiety.
Right.
Then there's the elevated plus maze, also for anxiety. And they use the tail suspension test and the forced swimming test. Those last two, they measure what's called behavioral despair. Basically, how long they keep trying to get out of a tough spot before they just give up.
Interesting. So those are pretty standard ways to check mood in animals.
Yeah.
But they didn't stop at just watching their behavior.
No. They also look for changes in their bodies.
Okay.
They were really interested in this one protein called interleukin 17A.
Okay.
They measured how much of it the mice were making in their spleen, their blood, and even their brains. For that, they used flow cytometry and histological analysis.
Interleukin 17A, is that something to do with the immune system?
It is. It's it's a cytokine. The immune system uses it to kickstart inflammation and immune responses.
Oh, okay.
But lately, scientists have found that inflammation can really affect the brain and mental health.
Wow.
So the researchers figured maybe a high-salt diet messes with interleukin 17A levels, and that's how diet and mood connect.
I see. So they measured interleukin 17A. What else did they do? It sounds like they had a few more tricks up their sleeve.
Oh, yeah. To be really sure that interleukin 17A was behind the behaviors they saw, they used these genetically modified mice.
Oh, okay.
These mice couldn't make a certain thing called retinoic acid receptor-related orphan receptor gamma T.
Oh, my goodness.
You need that to make interleukin 17A. So by using mice that couldn't make the protein, they could see if the salt's effect on behavior actually depended on having interleukin 17A around.
So retinoic acid receptor-related orphan receptor gamma tech is like the key to making interleukin 17A.
Exactly. It's like the master switch for that gene.
Did they also figure out which specific cells were pumping out all this interleukin 17A because of all that extra salt?
You bet. Through some really in-depth analysis, they found that gamma delta T cells were the main source of interleukin 17A in the mice on the high salt diet.
Gamma delta T cells.
Yeah, there were this unusual kind of T cell. They act like a first line of defense in the immune system.
Yeah.
And can release inflammatory signals like interleukin 17A really fast.
So it's not just a general immune response.
Nope, it's specific.
Wow.
And to be extra sure, they even used an antibody to knock down the gamma delta T cells in some of the mice on the high-salt diet.
Oh, wow.
Then they checked if having fewer of those cells changed their depression-like behavior.
That's really digging deep into the connection. So after all these experiments, what did they learn? Like, what were the main takeaways?
Well, the results were pretty big.
Okay.
First, they saw that the mice on the high-salt diet did show behaviors that looked like depression. And this was true across all the tests. They explored less, they stayed away from open spaces, and they didn't try as hard to escape, just like the stressed-out mice.
So the high-salt diet, like, had a similar effect on their behavior as actual stress.
Right. And second, they found way more interleukin-17A in the high-salt mice.
Okay.
In their spleen, blood, and brain.
Wow.
That backs up the idea that salt intake could be tied to this inflammatory protein.
And what about the mice that couldn't make interleukin-17A in the first place?
That's the cool part.
Okay.
The ones lacking that retinoic acid receptor-related orphan receptor gamma T, the ones that couldn't make interleukin-17A, they didn't get those depression-like behaviors even on the high-salt diet.
No way.
And their interleukin-17A levels stayed normal.
Wow.
So it looks like interleukin-17A is super important for salt to have this effect on behavior.
That is huge.
Yeah, it basically confirms interleukin-17A as a key link in the chain.
And the gamma delta T cells, what was their role in all of this?
Well, they turn out to be the main source of all that extra interleukin-17A in the high-salt mice.
Okay.
And even more convincing, when they got rid of some gamma delta T cells in the high-salt mice, their depression-like behavior went down a lot.
So the chain of events is high salt, then more interleukin-17A from gamma delta T cells, and then behaviors that look like depression.
Yep, that's a really good summary.
So this study gives us a pretty good idea of how high salt might lead to those depression-like behaviors in mice.
Right.
Okay, so those are some fascinating results in mice.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for us humans?
Well, think about how much salt is in our diets these days.
Right.
It's everywhere, especially in like the Western world.
Yeah.
The study authors even point out that fast food can have over 100 times more salt than homemade meals.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So lots of people are getting way more sodium chloride than they realize,
Yeah.
And this study suggests that those quick, salty meals might have a bigger impact than we thought.
Wow. So is it possible that all the salt in our food is playing a part in human depression?
Well, it's definitely possible these mouse findings could apply to us.
Yeah.
Remember how we said some older studies found a link between high salt and depression in large groups of people?
Yeah.
And the study even mentions another one where cutting back on sodium improved mood, especially in women after menopause.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Now, that study looked at overall mood, not specifically depression, but it does suggest that sodium can affect how we feel.
Right.
And this new mouse study may explain that connection.
I see.
It suggests there's a direct link between something we eat every day and this inflammatory pathway that gets messed up in some people with depression.
Wow. So this isn't a totally new idea. There's some evidence in humans already.
Yeah, exactly. And this mouse research gives us a possible explanation for why it happens.
Yeah.
If the same thing's happening in us, it could mean changing our diets, like cutting back on salt, might be a new way to prevent or manage depression.
That's a pretty big deal. Like, something we can control might have a noticeable impact on our mental health. It's kind of scary to think that something so common in our food could affect our mood like that.
Yeah, it does open up some really interesting possibilities for, like, dietary changes and future research.
Of course, we got to be careful about applying animal study findings to humans.
Of course, yeah.
What are some things to keep in mind about this study? Like, what are the limitations?
Okay, well, first off, this was all done on mice. Mice are great for studying biology, but we can't be totally sure the same thing happens in people.
Right.
We definitely need more research with actual humans to confirm these findings.
So we can't say for sure, based on this study alone, that high salt intake causes depression in people.
Right. We just don't know for sure yet.
Okay.
And second, while this study found that specific pathway with interleukin-17A and gamma delta T cells, depression is complicated.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing. It's our genes, our environment, all sorts of stuff. So even if high salt does play a role in human depression, there are probably other ways it does it besides this one pathway.
Like it's one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Exactly. And last, they only looked at the high salt diet for a short time in these mice, just 5 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
We don't know what happens long term, like if you eat a lot of salt for years and years.
Right.
More research on long-term exposure is needed to understand the full impact.
Those are all really important points to remember. Okay, so considering these findings and the limitations, What's your take on the study as an expert? What are the key takeaways?
I think the biggest thing is that they pinpointed gamma delta T cells and interleukin 17A as potentially crucial for the link between high salt and those depression-like behaviors.
Yeah.
That's a brand new finding, and it changes how we think about what might cause depression.
Wow.
It really shows how connected our immune system, our diet, and our brain health are.
It emphasizes that everything in our body is connected, really.
Absolutely. And their conclusion that cutting back on salt might be a good way to deal with depression is also a big deal.
Yeah.
It suggests a whole new direction for preventing and managing this, this really tough condition.
Right.
But like we said, we need to study this in people before we can make any solid recommendations.
Okay, so we can't tell people what to do just yet, but this gives us a good reason to keep looking into it.
Exactly. It's a big step towards understanding the connection between something very common in our diet and a major mental health issue.
So what should our listeners be thinking about now? What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I'd say the most important thing is to be mindful of how much sodium you're eating. Like we've been saying, there's so much salt in modern diets, especially hidden in processed foods and restaurant meals.
Yeah.
This research suggests our eating habits might be affecting not just things like blood pressure, but our mental well-being too.
It really makes you think twice about that extra salt or those pre-made meals.
It does.
And maybe our listeners could look into the bigger connection between diet and mental health.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
There's lots of research on inflammation and mood disorders, and the study adds to that.
Absolutely.
Maybe they could research that link on their own.
That'd be great.
So here's a final thought, Shneu. Could something as simple as cutting back on salt actually have a big impact on how we all feel mentally? This research definitely makes us think about that.
It sure does.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.